about the meeting at Helena. And thank you, Jason. That was very wonderful. Well, what did turn me to Galatians? I'm sorry, your scripture. First Corinthians chapter 15. That was good, though. Thank you for sharing that. That was a powerful thought. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 1. I kind of felt attracted to this verse today. There's so many good places to read from. So many good chapters. Every time I open one of these up, I think, hey, this is one of my favorite chapters. I heard a man say one time, a preacher, somebody asked him, how do you find something to talk about week after week? And he said, well, I've got a book here that'll preach itself if you just read from it. And that's kind of how it is. Everything's good. There's always so many good things here. But I think this is interesting. This is the conclusion of Paul's letter to the Corinthians. And keep in mind that the Corinthians, the church in Corinth, is a church that Paul himself started. He was the originator of this church by going to this place called Corinth and preaching the gospel. So he's not a stranger to them, and he is the one who preached to them in the beginning, and they responded to his preaching, and there are Christians in the church here because of Paul's preaching. And here, after writing 14 chapters, he begins chapter 15 by saying this, Moreover, brethren, I declare unto you the gospel. And I'm just going to stop right there and say, when he says I declare, this is the King James translation. The word declare, it makes it sound like I'm telling you, I'm preaching to you the gospel. He's already preached the gospel to them before. This isn't the first time. But what he's doing is he's reminding them of it. And that's what most other translations say. I want to remind you of the gospel, which I preached unto you, and which also you received, wherein you stand, by which you're saved, if you keep in memory what I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered unto you first of all, and that phrase first of all means of first importance. Of first importance, that which I also received, how that Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again on the third day, according to the Scriptures. Now, I pointed out to you that in the first verse, back in verse 1, he says, Brethren, I declare to you the gospel. He literally, he's saying, I want to remind you of the gospel. And I think it's interesting to note that these are Christians that he's talking to. He's not talking to the world. He's not talking to sinners or people that don't know. But I think sometimes we get the idea that the gospel is just a message for sinners, basically to tell them you need to get saved. But Paul is saying to these Christians who are already Christians because of his preaching, I want to remind you of the gospel. And I find that that's true. I think as Christians we need to be reminded also of the gospel. Now, I don't advise and advocate anybody to do what I've done, and I don't encourage anybody to go out and start a church. But if you do, here's my next advice. If you happen to go start a church, just try to avoid going to pastors' meetings where all the pastors get together and talk. Because I'm a friendly person, and I like to go and visit with people and talk to people. But here's what my experience has been sometimes. All the pastors get together, and we all sit around a big table, and then somebody says, well, what are you preaching? Well, first they wanted to say, how many do you have? That's some of the first. I'm sorry to smile about that. How many do you have? And what I always say is, I don't have any of them. Jesus has got them all. I'll just talk to whoever happens to be here. But I'm glad you're here, by the way. I don't mean that I'm not. But anyway, after we discuss how many do you have, the next question that comes up is, what are you preaching? And I remember vividly, and I'm not just making this up now. This is a real thing that happened. And I was asked, what are you preaching? And I said, I tried, and this was my answer, I try to confine and restrict what I preach just to the gospel and to the finished work of Christ, and just try to make everything be about that. And I would have thought, I felt pretty good about that answer. I would have thought they'd say, good for you. But that wasn't the response I got. It seemed provocative for some reason. It was as though the gospel, well, you're in church, you don't need to be preaching the gospel to Christians, that's for people, that was sort of the thought, And one person said, and this is what I really didn't get, I shouldn't be telling you this, but I am anyway. One person said, well, how do you balance that? I thought, well, balance that? With what? What do you want me to do? Give equal time to the devil? What am I supposed to do? How do I balance that? I don't understand that at all. But I do understand this, that the idea of the thought is that the gospel is a message for everybody else, meaning you need to receive Jesus, which is true. That's true. But here Paul, notice that Paul says, I want to remind you, I declare unto you, brethren. Brethren means Christians, brothers. I want to remind you of the gospel. Evidently, Paul thought that the gospel was a message that was something that we need to be reminded of. Would you agree that's what he's saying here? And then he says, I preached it to you, and you received it, and you're standing by means of it, wherein you stand. And then he says, verse 2, by which you're saved. That is, by believing in the gospel. And then he says, if you keep in memory. In other words, he wants us to keep in memory that which he preached to us. Now, first of all, when we say he preached to them the gospel, and that's what they received, and that's why they're saved, well, what is the gospel then? That's the next question we can ask ourselves. Well, first of all, I want to remind you that the word gospel itself means good news. It literally means good news. And right away, when I find that out, when I discovered that the word gospel, which is this message that he's reminding us and wants us to be reminded of, when I see that it means good news, what that tells me is that anything that I have to say that's not good news is not the gospel. Do you follow my logic on that? If I get up here and tell you something is not good news, there might be some factual truth in it, but it's not the gospel. And what I find is it's not really what we need to hear, and it's not really going to help. There's a lot of things we could say that are religious, and a lot of things that we could say are even true in some sense, but not everything's going to help us, you see. For instance, I could get up here and talk about sin, and I could talk about bad behavior, but did you know that's not going to help you any? It's not. See, it'd be like a sick person going to the doctor, and then the doctor sits down with him and says, now let me tell you all about sickness and disease. That's not going to help. You need the remedy. When you go to the doctor, you don't want to know more and have the sickness and disease reinforced. You want to have the remedy. You could just skip all the talk about the sickness and disease. You know all about it because you're experiencing it, you see. But when you go to the doctor, you want the remedy. And, he could just cut out all the talk and just get right to the remedy, and that'd be just fine. Isn't that right?
Yes.
See, I appreciate Jason being here and giving his testimony today. And there's another man I remember came through BJCC, and his name was Doug. Doug Marzine was his name, and he had a good experience, and just like Jason, he came to our Sunday night services and enjoyed those, and went out and everything worked. God worked. It's funny how you just live your life like a Christian would live, and God just puts everything together for you. Isn't that amazing? And Doug called me up about a year after being out here at BJCC when he was discharged. He called me about a year later, and he said, "I want to tell you that I went back. Oklahoma City was his home, and he said I just decided I found it. Well, wait. He said I got a job. That's the first thing he said. I got a job, and I didn't think anything of it. I just went to work just every day like I was supposed to at the time I was supposed to be there, and I thought that's just what I should do, just no big deal. But after about 3 or 4 months doing that, the manager said to me, he says, "You are the only employee I have that comes every day and comes on time." He says, "I didn't think anything about it. I thought, well, I'm a Christian. That's just what I ought to do, So he made him like the I don't know what like a manager, a shift manager. And then he said, after a few more months, he says, you come every day, and you never skip, and you're faithful. I can trust you. So I'm going to make you manager of this restaurant. He made him the manager of the restaurant. And then when he was calling me, he says he's even talking about selling me the restaurant, letting it be mine. This is after 1 year after being discharged from BJCC. And he said, God has just done all this. All I've done is just do what I thought natural to do as a Christian, just do my thing. But he said, that's not really why I'm calling. And are you ready for this? Ready for why he's calling? He said, I want to ask you if you know any good churches in Oklahoma City. And I said, Oklahoma City, there's probably a church on every corner, It's kind of like Tulsa, I mean, they're a big place, and there's churches everywhere. He says, well, I know that's true. And I'm not joking about this. He told me that this is true. He said, I've been trying out all these different churches, and I just don't feel like I'm getting what I need to get. And he said, the last one I felt like it was going to be okay, but the pastor started a series. He started a series of sermons on sin. And every week he talks about a different sin. And 1 week it's this, and he mentioned to me, and I'm not going to tell you all the different topics, you can imagine. And 1 week it's this, 1 week it's that, and 1 week it's this, 1 week it's that. He says, after like 3 or 4 weeks of hearing about sin every week, he says, I'm getting so depressed I don't want to go back anymore.
Right.
But you see, we don't need the problem, we need the remedy.
Amen.
And the remedy is the gospel. And the gospel means good news. Now, listen to this. If I stand up here and I talk about you, and I talk about your behavior, did you know I could be talking about some things that are true in a certain sense, but it's not good news. What's good news is to talk about Jesus instead. Instead of telling you what you need to do,